And NATO leaders forged a membership pledge for Ukraine and took a stronger stance on China's support for Russia. That is the Washington Declaration drawn up at their 75th summit. Let's discuss it more with Professor Joshua Shifrinson. Welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for joining us. So NATO leaders vowed lasting support for Ukraine, over $43 billion and 5 new strategic air defense systems. The question is this enough for Ukraine to continue its fight against Russia?
Well, certainly it's enough for Ukraine to continue the fight. Whether it's enough for Ukraine to win the fight, that is, retake all the territory that Russia seized in the initial stages of the war, is really another matter altogether. We've seen thus far in the war real challenges for the Ukrainian military in overcoming Russian manpower and military advantages. And so while the West has tried to respond with significant military assistance packages and air defenses, it's unclear at this time whether this will be enough to help Ukraine achieve what Ukraine sees as its own definition victory.
Well, then would you say this is the best result out of the NATO summit, or not as much?
Well, I think it's about as good as we could reasonably hope, because as we know from the last 2.5 years of the war, NATO allies have been very reluctant to take steps that might actually bring them into a war and bring them into a direct conflict with Moscow. So by continuing to provide military assistance to Ukraine, it's about the maximum of what the West and what the allies can do short of direct intervention. So I think it's about the best plausible outcome from the summit. Even if it isn't the best possible outcome. Yeah.
Maybe for now. And many are casting doubts over NATO's promise to send support to Ukraine, as it may not last long, especially if Donald Trump returns to the White House. Are you on the same page?
Oh, yes. I think if Donald Trump returns to the White House, all bets are off. It becomes very unclear whether the West will continue, whether the U.S. will continue providing the same level of assistance to Ukraine, if any assistance at all.
Well, then what does NATO need to do to prepare for such a scenario,
Well, so one thing that came up during the summit, which has come up the last 2 summits, is the need for the allies to rebuild their militaries after the post-Cold War drawdown. We've seen more countries have responded to the 2% pledge. We've also seen, more importantly, countries begin to rebuild brigades, rebuild artillery, invest in military enablers. And so I think that's what's really going to be needed going forward, more efforts along those lines to hedge against the possibility of an American cutoff or perhaps some kind of stalemate in Ukraine over the long term.
Definitely. And of course, North Korea and Russia's deepening military ties were among the items topping the agenda at the 75th NATO summit. Professor, do walk us through how the relationship is a common threat to the NATO and also the IP4 countries.
Well, I think it's certainly true that North Korean assistance to Russia has helped Russia stay in this fight and actually stand up to the combined efforts of the NATO allies. And so in that regard, I do agree that growing Russian-North Korean solidarity is a real problem for both areas. I think at the same time, both the Indo-Pacific and the European countries have different perceptions of exactly how intense these threats are and how unified they'll be over the long term. So right now they're agreed. I think over the long term, there may be a little more disagreement coming down.
And on top of North Korea and Russia, there was also China. NATO members this year called Beijing a decisive enabler of Russia's war in Ukraine, perhaps in the hope that calling the country will stop China from backing Moscow so much. But what actual steps or measures can NATO and the IP4 come up with that will actually dissuade China from aiding Russia?
Well, so the problem is right now, it's not a matter of dissuading China from aiding Russia. It's actually getting China to change course. It's a coercive issue. And I think the problem there is the NATO allies have very few toolkits. They can certainly condemn Chinese efforts, but as we know, economic sanctions against China are going to be of limited appeal to the West and very limited impact in China itself. It's not like the West is going to go to war with China over this issue. So the reality is that you need a diplomatic solution, and I'm just not sure that calling China out in this fashion is what takes you forward to that end.
And South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol was invited to the summit for the 3rd year in a row. That's a first for any South Korean leader in history. How is South Korea's status being recognized on a global level?
Well, I think it's obvious. South Korea is seen as a critical provider of military assistance, of economic assistance to many countries. It's been a prominent diplomatic supporter of the fight against Russia via NATO. And I think, too, it reflects the fact that South Korea produces some of the best military hardware, some of the highest tech military equipment in the world. And so this really shows South Korea's maturation as an important player in important areas on the global stage today.
Well, I have to ask you, will South Korea be invited next year again? What do you think?
Well, I think it depends a lot if Donald Trump is president. I think if he is, unclear. But if he isn't, I would expect South Korea to reappear.
Well, before I let you go, South Korea has been hinting of providing lethal weapons to Ukraine if, Russia continues to cross the line by cooperating so much with North Korea militarily. Do you think that option is still being considered? And if South Korea does go ahead with that plan, when would that be?
Well, so I don't know when that plan would come into fruition. We know, though, that it takes a very long time for military supplies to reach Ukraine because of simply supply lines, excuse me. I think it's plausible that South Korea may go down this road, especially as the Russian-North Korean alignment deepens. It's unclear, though, over what time frame that will occur, and it's unclear if that will be in time for it to have a battlefield effect, given the current fight in Ukraine.
Definitely. All right, Professor, thank you so much for joining us this morning. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.